For part two of our presentation, we're going to start looking at the CAPM model, the FEMA French, the FEMA Macbeth, and that's where we'll start right now. And we'll look at our forecasting prices. You know, it was nice with the CAPM model. I think it really backed up what we all wanted. It showed all of us should invest in all of our companies, and we saw returns anywhere from 2.5% to 5%, which was a good return and made us feel like, as we moved into the portfolio stage of this project, that all four of our companies were worth the investment. The FEMA Macbeth model with the one factor showed us that we saw small growth. We saw small growth in all four of these companies. It started with the biggest, Telecom Argentina. Meredith gets the bragging rights here, at 1.21%, and then it went to Comcast at 0.80%. AT&T at 0.35%, and then Verizon at 0.32%. So at least I have bragging rights over Sean when it comes to AT&T versus Verizon in that battle. FEMA French, with the three factors, it actually showed an even better return for us. And once again, Meredith comes in first with Telecom Argentina at 2.63%, then Comcast at 2.17%, AT&T and Verizon, both the cellar dwellers here, they're about the same, but not bad returns for this industry, 1.45% for AT&T and 1.25% for Verizon. And at that point, we decided to move into the portfolio stage, and we basically determined that while this was a very safe industry, there is some risk here, not as much risk as there is in a lot of other industries, and Sean's going to back that up with the portfolio analysis.
So there are three things I'd like to kind of discuss here. What came out of our findings as we analyze these companies and use the methods. Something we noticed was with variances and correlations. Also with our portfolio weight, something interesting with how we applied the solver and what came out of those calculations. And then also, kind of when the rubber hits the road, the portfolio risk, what the impact of the standard deviation of the portfolio was on the total portfolio returns. So taking a look at variances and correlations, as you look at the variances, and this is out of the Garch model, as you look at the variances of these numbers, you know, they're meaningful, but they're not very intuitive. So one thing we did is to calculate the standard deviation. We took each variance and we divided by each of the assets' standard deviation, and down here that gave us our correlation coefficient. And so here we have a number from -1 to 1. -1 being inversely correlated, these two assets, 0 being no correlation at all, and then 1 being highly correlated. And this gave us kind of a pretty good bird's eye view of, if you take a look at Verizon and TEO, you know, they're still correlated, but there's not a lot of correlation there. As comparison to Verizon and AT&T, which we would expect, being similar companies, they would be highly correlated, and they are in comparison to the others. So that, again, that gave us kind of a meaningful and intuitive number that we could actually look at. The other thing we noticed was with the solver application, and as I go over here to this sheet, we can see that Verizon, which has a risk of 5.36, it actually has the lowest risk out of all of them. AT&T is next, a little higher, Comcast a little higher, and then TEO has the highest. But what Solver liked to do is it took the lowest risk and the highest risk, and it used those for the calculation of the portfolio rates. It didn't even look at AT&T and Comcast. So what we decided to do, we wanted everybody to have a shot here playing in the game. We put a constraint that said everybody should be at least 10%. And so what that did is it forced AT&T and Comcast to be at least 10%. And so what Solver did at that point is, if you look back here in comparison between the two, it decreased Verizon from 74 down to 53, and with TEO it upped that just a little bit. So what it did is it took some of the risk that we had allocated here, and it took it from Verizon. And I'll show you some graphs here in a second. But first, I do want to talk about the standard deviation. Now, standard deviation is kind of a measurement of risk in your portfolio. If you have higher standard deviation, you're probably going to have higher risk, you're going to have higher volatility. And what we were given as far as the spreadsheet that we downloaded, that had a standard deviation of 6. And so we thought to ourselves, well, what would happen if we gave it a little more standard deviation if we were a little more risky investor? So what we did is, using our GARCH and our solver, is we said, let's look at what happens if we have a standard deviation of 10, and what impact would that have on each of our portfolio weights. And as you can see, it does have an impact to where TEO on the 10 goes up significantly, up to 70, and meanwhile Verizon, again, drops significantly because we're assuming more risk. And so we look at it, we took a look at the impact of that standard deviation on our returns. And we took prices from 2008, which was not a good year for stocks at all, and we took prices from 2010, which was a pretty good year, and just kind of emphasize this impact. And so starting off at $10,000, the 2008 here is in red. You can see at a standard deviation of 10, we have a pretty wide gap here between the 2010 pricing that we're going to get at the end of the year of a gain of almost $4,000 versus 2008, we're going to lose, go down to $5,000, we're going to lose almost $5,000 in 2008. And the thing to notice here is this gap. Down here with standard deviation of 6, we're assuming a little less risk, and so the gap is going to be smaller between those two. Here we're only losing about $2,500, but then here we're only gaining, as a comparison to this, instead of $4,000, we're only gaining about $2,000. Now, the other thing we wanted to look at was what was the impact of forcing Comcast and AT&T to be 10%. And so we ran the same type of analysis, and we said, you know, these have a 10% minimum. And I'm going to kind of flip back and forth, and so you can see with the same standard deviation, the charts are the same standard deviation here, the charts are the same, 10% minimum. So what that tells us is that I think our solver tool did a fairly good job of compensating for that risk. When we wanted it to be less risky, it took down TEO's risk. When we wanted it to be more risky, it took down Verizon's allocation and allocated more of that to TEO. And Sean's going to talk about the conclusion.
Well, in conclusion, we looked at all this stuff, and at the end, it was kind of what it was at the beginning. We all looked at these companies as something that we would all put investment in. Meredith has a big risk, big reward. I think the rest of us have more of a low risk, low reward. But at the same time, it's reward is the key word there. All of these companies in this portfolio do show a reward, be it a minimal one. If you're wanting to go with a safe bet, you would probably go with these companies. With Meredith's, it's not as safe of a bet, but still a safe bet nonetheless. So we would certainly say to invest in the communications industry. It's something that's growing and has big potential for growth as time goes on. And we thank you for your time, and thank you for letting us share this presentation.